Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Hey, Chris. Glad to be back in the studio with you because today we have what I think is genuinely one of the most consequential infrastructure stories of the entire spring across the whole AI ecosystem.
Okay, you've got me hooked already, but let's set the stage carefully for listeners who haven't been tracking the Agentic infrastructure beat over the last couple of weeks of constant announcements.
So the headline is this. On April 30th, Cloudflare and Stripe jointly announced an open protocol that lets AI agents create cloud accounts, buy domain names, start paid subscriptions, and deploy production apps with no human in the loop at any point.
Wait, no human in the loop at all, including no human typing in a credit card number or clicking accept on a terms of service page anywhere in the entire deployment flow?
That is exactly what they shipped, and the way they pulled it off without setting fire to the security model is, in my opinion, the actually interesting engineering story underneath the announcement itself.
All right, let's break this down piece by piece because I think a lot of folks listening have been hearing about agents for 2 years and are still skeptical that any of it really works in production.
Fair skepticism, and the honest answer is that until last week, the missing piece for serious agentic systems was not reasoning quality or model intelligence. It was commercial plumbing for the agent to actually buy things on its own.
Which is wild when you say it out loud because the models have been able to write production code for over a year, but they couldn't execute a credit card transaction safely without a human pressing a button.
Right, and the protocol Cloudflare and Stripe published has 3 named primitives that map cleanly to the 3 things any commercial transaction needs in the wild: discovery, authorization, and payment.
Walk me through discovery first, because that name suggests something more interesting than just having the agent read a docs page or scrape a marketing site full of half-accurate product copy.
Discovery is a structured catalog query the agent runs against a provider, so it can ask Cloudflare or any other compliant platform what services exist, what they cost, and what the SLAs look like in real time.
So instead of the agent guessing or hallucinating product names, the platform itself returns a machine-readable menu of what is actually available to buy right now from that specific provider.
Exactly. And that matters because hallucinated product names have been a real failure mode in the early agentic demos, where the agent confidently tries to provision a product that doesn't exist or was deprecated last quarter.
Okay, and once the agent picks a service, then we move into authorization, which is where I assume the OAuth dance comes in for users with existing Cloudflare accounts on the platform.
You've got it, and this is where the design gets clever, because the protocol handles 2 distinct user states without requiring the agent to know which one applies to the human it's working for.
2 states meaning a user who already has an account with the provider and a user who has never even heard of that provider before in their life or touched their dashboard.
Precisely. And for an existing account holder, Stripe kicks off a standard OAuth consent flow where the user grants the Stripe project's CLI permission to provision resources on their existing Cloudflare account through scoped credentials.
That's the part I actually like because it preserves the human consent step at the moment that matters, which is granting the long-lived credential, not on every single transaction the agent fires off later.
Yes, and for a user who has no Cloudflare account yet, Cloudflare just provisions one automatically, tied to their Stripe identity, and hands the credentials straight to the agent so it can start working immediately.
I want to slow down on that auto-provisioning step, because to me that is the genuinely new behavior, not just OAuth dressed up in agent clothing for the marketing blog post.
Agreed, and the way to think about it is this. Cloudflare is treating Create Me a New Tenant for this human's agent as a first-class API operation, not a manual sign-up form.
Which means the friction floor for spinning up new infrastructure just dropped from fill out a form, verify your email, add a payment method, all the way down to a single agent prompt.
That's the framing in the Cloudflare blog post, and InfoWorld had a really sharp line about this being the moment the keys to the cloud get handed to software, not to people.
Now, the third piece is payment. And this is the part that should make every CFO and every security architect stop scrolling and pay close attention to what is actually being shipped here.
Payment is where Stripe issues a payment token to the provider, and crucially, the raw card number, the CVV, none of the actual instrument data is ever exposed to the agent itself in the session.
So that even if an attacker manages to compromise the agent's runtime, they cannot exfiltrate a credit card from the session because there is no credit card sitting in that session to begin with.
Right, the agent just holds an opaque token that authorizes a specific scope of spending against a specific provider. And Stripe is the party actually pulling the funds and reconciling the ledger.
Tell me about the spend cap. Because I read that there's a default ceiling, but I want to understand whether that's a real guardrail or just marketing fluff dressed up in security language.
It's a real guardrail, and the default sits at $100 per month per provider, which Cloudflare and Stripe explicitly say users can configure higher or lower depending on their organizational appetite for risk.
$100 feels deliberately conservative, like they wanted the early reviewers to feel like even a runaway agent couldn't drain a corporate bank account on day one of going live.
That seems exactly right, and a developer over on DevDot wrote a piece arguing that runtime spend rails are now a concrete primitive, not a hand-wavy concept on a whiteboard somewhere.
Let's talk about that framing for a minute, because runtime spend rails is the kind of phrase that either becomes industry vocabulary in the next year or gets forgotten in 6 months.
The reason I think it sticks is that every previous attempt at agentic commerce assumed humans would be in the approval path for every dollar, which scales terribly for any genuinely autonomous workflow.
Whereas this design says humans approve a budget envelope up front, and then the agent operates inside that envelope until it bumps the ceiling or runs out of headroom for the month.
Exactly. And that's the same pattern corporate procurement cards have used for 30 years for human employees. Except now the card holder is a piece of software and the controls are entirely programmatic.
Okay, but I want to play devil's advocate here, because handing a software process the ability to buy infrastructure on its own raises a lot of accountability questions that nobody has good answers for yet.
That's the right question, and Computer World basically led with it, asking whether the industry is really ready to give agents the keys to the cloud and to the wallet at the same exact moment.
My specific worry is liability. If my agent provisions a domain that gets used to phish customers, who exactly is on the hook? Me, the agent vendor, the model provider, or Cloudflare itself in that scenario?
The protocol doesn't fully resolve that, but it does hardwire identity attestation, meaning every action is tied back to a verified Stripe customer, which creates a clear audit trail for downstream forensics work.
An audit trail is useful for after the fact, but it doesn't prevent the bad action in the first place, which is what really matters when domains can be registered in seconds without review.
That is the trade-off, and Cloudflare's bet is that the combination of bounded spend, OAuth scoped credentials, and full audit logging is enough scaffolding for a V1 of agentic commerce out in the wild.
Let me ask the comparison question, because I keep thinking about the launch of OAuth itself back in the late 2000s, which felt small at the time and reshaped the entire API economy afterward.
That comparison is the right one, and a lot of the early reactions on Hacker News and on developer Twitter explicitly frame this as an OAuth-like moment for autonomous software systems on the open web.
Because OAuth made it safe for one application to act on behalf of a user inside another application. And this protocol makes it safe for an agent to act on behalf of a user inside a provider.
And just like OAuth, the real test will not be whether Cloudflare and Stripe like their own protocol. It will be whether other clouds, other payment networks, and other providers actually adopt it at scale.
That's the open question, because if AWS and Google Cloud build their own incompatible flavors, we end up with a fragmented agent commerce landscape instead of a clean shared standard everybody can target safely.
And there are real competitive incentives to fragment, because owning the protocol means owning the metering, the billing, and the long-term vendor relationship for an entire generation of autonomous workloads to come.
Which is also why I think Cloudflare and Stripe moved first and moved together, because shipping a credible joint reference implementation makes it harder for anyone else to claim leadership on this primitive going forward.
Right, and Stripe in particular has a track record of using developer-first protocols to lock in long-term position. And Cloudflare has done the same thing in edge compute over the last decade or so.
Now, I want to zoom out and connect this story to a couple of other agentic news beats from the last week, because they actually fit together more tightly than people realize on first read.
Yeah, you're thinking about the Salesforce Headless API announcement, where the entire Salesforce platform is now exposed to agents through structured endpoints with no human user interface required to access data or fire off workflows.
Right, because if Salesforce gives agents access to enterprise data and workflows, and Cloudflare and Stripe give them the ability to provision infrastructure and pay for it, then you have both halves of an autonomous business stack.
That is the convergence I find genuinely striking, because for 2 years we've talked about agents in isolation. And this week, the connective tissue between agent, payment, infrastructure, and enterprise data finally started to show up in shipping form.
Let me bring it back to what listeners should actually do with this information, because not everybody listening is going to ship an agent that buys domains tomorrow morning before their first meeting starts.
For most folks, the immediate takeaway is that the autonomy ceiling for agentic systems just got measurably higher, which means the kinds of products you can plausibly build inside the next 12 months expanded considerably.
For builders, the practical step is to install the Stripe Project's CLI plugin, run the demo, and feel for yourself how short the path is from prompt to deployed application on a real domain.
For security and compliance leaders, the practical step is to start drafting policy now for what your organization will and will not allow agents to provision and to spend on their own without human approval.
And for everyone else, the takeaway is that the agentic commerce wave is no longer a slide deck conversation. It is a working protocol with real money flowing through it as we speak right now.
Which is honestly the line I'd put on the poster, because for 2 years, skeptics have asked when agents would actually do real work, and this is one of the clearest yes answers we have yet.
I think that's a great place to wrap because the headline isn't just that agents can buy stuff now. It's that buying stuff was the missing primitive that quietly unlocks almost everything else downstream.
Couldn't have said it better, and we'll be tracking the adoption curve closely over the next few weeks as more providers either join the protocol or quietly ship competing flavors of their own to compete.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.